I am Captain Koudiati Prosper from the 17th graduating class of the Jean Manon Military Academy in Pau, currently serving at the Air Force General Staff. I was arrested on January 2, 2026, following an attempt to destabilize the current government.
At 1:17 a.m., Captain Prosper Koudiati's phone vibrated with a number that did not belong to Burkina Faso. It was from Togo. No greeting, no explanation, just a short instruction: install Zangi. That message did not sound like a coup, and that was the point. In the days that followed, encrypted apps replaced barracks, disappearing messages replaced orders, and cash replaced ideology, quietly assembling a machine that was meant to collapse an entire country without a single tank rolling through the streets. Why would a former leader run a coup from another country? Why would a drone commander matter more than the president? And why did 8 million CFA francs move before any shot was fired? Because this was not chaos or rebellion. It was a precision operation designed to blind Burkina Faso first, and only then take power. And that single call was the moment everything changed. Let's talk about it in detail. The story of how this coup was built does not begin with angry soldiers or secret meetings in dark rooms. It begins with a phone call that looks harmless and administrative, the kind of call that does not raise alarms because it feels routine. Henri Sandaogo Damiba, the former leader Ibrahim Traoré had removed from power, did not call from Ouagadougou or from a military office. He called from Togo. That detail is not cosmetic. It is structural. Running the operation from outside Burkina Faso meant he could coordinate without being physically present, protect himself from immediate arrest, and hide the fingerprints of whoever was backing him. From that first contact, Damiba never announced a plan or spoke the language of rebellion. He asked Captain Prosper to install Zangi, an encrypted messaging app designed to make communication invisible. When Prosper installed it, Damiba did not even speak. He simply checked in, silently, creating a rhythm of contact that felt technical, almost boring, while slowly normalizing secrecy as the new normal. Once Prosper was comfortable on Zangi, the real architecture appeared. Damiba shifted sensitive communication to Signal, another encrypted platform, where messages could disappear after seconds. Nothing was written that could later become evidence. No orders were framed as orders. Everything was coded, indirect, and deliberately vague, because this was not about inspiration. It was about deniability. Prosper was not being radicalized. He was being integrated into a system that was already running.
I was contacted 2 weeks ago by Lieutenant Colonel Henri Sandaogo Damiba using a number from Togo. After several missed calls, when I finally answered, he introduced himself and asked me to install Zangui, which I did. He had me log into Zangui a few times to check in on me without saying anything else. I should mention that Colonel Damiba had my number for a long time.
From Ghana, a second figure entered the picture, Captain David, calling himself King David, who became the network's switchboard. He did not motivate soldiers or talk politics. He moved numbers, contacts, and instructions across borders, ensuring that Damiba could control the operation from Togo while remaining invisible inside Burkina Faso. This is how the coup avoided detection in its early phase. There were no meetings to raid and no speeches to record. Everything moved through private phones, foreign SIM cards, and encrypted apps that were designed for exactly this kind of shadow work. Prosper was never told, "We are overthrowing the government." Instead, he was slowly absorbed into a digital command structure that felt administrative rather than revolutionary, making it easier to participate without fully realizing the scale of what he was inside. The brilliance of the operation, and also its fatal flaw, was that it treated the coup like a software project, modular, decentralized, and built to survive if one part failed. Each person only knew what they needed to know, and Damiba alone sat at the center, assigning roles while protecting himself behind borders and encryption. By the time Prosper realized this was more than casual contact, the network already existed, with Damiba in Togo, King David in Ghana, and multiple couriers and intermediaries positioned to move information and resources inside Burkina Faso. The coup did not feel like a dramatic break from normal life. It felt like a technical upgrade to secrecy.
One day, Colonel Damiba contacted me to ask if I had the Signal app. I said yes. And he told me that someone would contact me on the Signal platform. Someone did indeed contact me on Signal on behalf of Colonel Damiba, and this person called himself King David. I want to clarify that King David is actually Captain David from the 14th graduating class. He is currently in Ghana. Over time, before the evening of December 31st, David and I would exchange messages, both among the older and younger members. As for Colonel Damiba, he would write to me, call me, but always with quotes. He spoke in parables and would ask if people were in good spirits, and so on. That being said, he never clearly stated from the outset that he had a plan. I also wanted to clarify regarding our conversations on Signal with King David that Captain Ouedraogo had suggested setting messages to disappear after 30 seconds. And also, when Colonel Damiba writes to me on Zangi, if I haven't read it after 10 minutes, he deletes the message.
That is why it was so dangerous, because it could grow without noise, without slogans, and without warning. And that raises the most important question of all. Once the network was quietly in place, how did they turn a digital architecture into real-world loyalty and commitment? The moment the coup stopped being a shadowy digital exercise and became a real-world operation was not when a weapon was issued or a unit was mobilized, but when money entered the story. Prosper did not receive a fiery call about saving the nation or restoring order. Instead, he received 2 phone numbers with no explanation, one for a man he was supposed to meet and one for the person who would receive what he collected. That silence was deliberate. It meant he could not ask questions, and it meant the operation could move without ever writing a single incriminating instruction. When the package finally arrived, it did not contain rifles or explosives. It contained 8 million CFA francs in cash, wrapped and ready, turning an abstract network into something tangible and irreversible. That cash was the true engine of the coup. 3 million francs stayed with Prosper as his payment, while 5 million moved forward through his brother to the next node in the chain. Proof that this was not a political movement but a financial system with budgets, margins, and delivery schedules. In that single exchange, a soldier became a transaction, and loyalty became a commodity. This is how modern coups actually work, not by persuading people with ideology, but by purchasing their participation with quiet, untraceable cash. The money did not just buy obedience, it bought silence because once Prosper accepted it, he crossed a line that made withdrawal dangerous. The operation had secured him not with threats, but with complicity. What makes this stage so revealing is how professional it was. No bank transfers, no paper trails, no official accounts. Everything moved through couriers, private phones, and trusted intermediaries so that no sponsor could ever be named and no chain could ever be fully traced. This is why the coup could be coordinated across Togo, Ghana, and Burkina Faso without ever appearing on a single ledger. The money was not a side detail. It was the bloodstream of the entire operation, allowing Damiba and his network to move people, buy time, and test loyalty before committing to the final phase. Once Prosper accepted the cash, the operation shifted from recruitment to execution. The digital architecture built through Zangi and Signal now had a physical backbone, because money gave the network weight and consequence. It also created a psychological lock. Prosper was no longer just an officer receiving messages. He was a participant who had something to lose if the plan collapsed. This is why coups begin with cash and end with gunfire, not the other way around. The money makes the violence possible, but it also makes retreat impossible.
On the evening of December 31st, Amimab's colleague contacted me to notify me that the king would have me sign this signal for a package, without specifying the nature of the package's contents. The king had me sign this signal, giving me 2 numbers, one for the person from whom I was to collect the package, and the other for the person to whom I was to deliver it. That's when I involved my brother, Sauron Robert. He got in touch with the person concerned and collected the package. I want to make it clear that Robert was just helping me out. When I got the package before he handed it over, I opened it. It was money. There were 8 million. I voluntarily decided to keep 3 million before having Robert deliver the remaining 5 million to the person concerned.
And yet, even at this point, Prosper still did not know the full objective. He knew there was a mission coming, but not what it would be. The operation had secured his loyalty without revealing its true target, keeping the most sensitive detail hidden until the very last moment, which leads to the next, far more dangerous stage. Once loyalty was bought, what exactly were they preparing to destroy? The real objective of the coup was not revealed until after the money had done its work, because this was not a plan you could sell with slogans. When Prosper was finally told what his role would be, the instruction came wrapped in a single, almost absurd phrase: cut off the pastor's head. It sounded like a metaphor, but it was not. The pastor was a code name for the commander of the drone base at Stephanie, and in that moment, the entire strategy became clear. This was never about marching on the presidential palace or flooding the streets with soldiers. It was about blinding Burkina Faso before anyone realized the country had been attacked. Burkina Faso's drones are not accessories. They are the backbone of its new security doctrine. After years of dependence on French and US surveillance, the Traoré government invested heavily in building its own aerial intelligence capability so it could see its own territory, track insurgent movements, and protect supply routes without asking permission from foreign powers. Those drones stitched the country together, turning scattered units into a coherent defensive system. Kill the commander, and that system collapses, because he was the human key that made the technology function. Without him, the drones become grounded machines, and the army becomes deaf and blind in a country where information is survival. That is why the mission came before the coup. The plan was to remove the commander first, not Traoré. Once the drone base was neutralized, the network would move units into action, exploiting the sudden darkness to take control without facing coordinated resistance. This was not a political gamble. It was a technical operation designed to collapse the state's security architecture in one precise cut. Everything that came before, from the encrypted apps to the cash transfers, was simply preparation for this moment, because without the drones, Burkina Faso would be vulnerable again to the very dependency Traoré had spent years dismantling.
Ali Maba's colleague wrote that he would call me on the evening of January 2nd for a mission he wanted to assign to me. Indeed, on the evening of January 2nd, as promised, Colonel Ami Bama called me to say that the necklace was to be shared between David and me. And the mission he wanted to assign to me was to cut off the pastor's head. I want to clarify that the pastor refers to Captain Passeré, who commands the drone base at Stephanie. Once the pastor's head was cut off, the drones would become inoperative so that the units could go into action. Because, according to Colonel Damiba, the Obisac was the base for the Sapone drones. From his position, Colonel Damiba had set up his command post from which he was in contact with certain people, and he alone knew who they were, to whom he had assigned specific roles. According to Colonel Damiba's schedule, I and all the other operatives were supposed to take action on January 3rd, 2026 at 11 p.m. I beg your excellency for clemency. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, to the people and to the entire military hierarchy.
What makes this stage so chilling is how calculated it was. The operation did not rely on mass defections or public unrest. It relied on removing a single node and watching the system fail. It treated the country like a machine, not a society, and it targeted the one component that could not be quickly replaced. This is why the confession matters so much. It shows that the coup was not born out of anger or chaos, but out of a deep understanding of how Burkina Faso had rebuilt its sovereignty and where that sovereignty was most fragile. And yet, for all its precision, the plan depended on one fatal assumption: that the state was still blind to what was happening. The network believed it was invisible, that the encrypted apps and cash couriers had kept it hidden, and that the commander would be removed before anyone understood what was unfolding. They were wrong, because while they were preparing to blind Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré was already watching them. So how did he see a blade that was designed to be invisible? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. The reason the coup collapsed is not that the plotters made a small mistake, but because they were operating inside a state that had already changed its rules without announcing it. While Damiba was building his network offshore and Prosper was being absorbed through apps and cash, Ibrahim Traoré was quietly rebuilding the internal nervous system of Burkina Faso. He did not respond to instability with speeches or purges. He responded with architecture. Intelligence units that once worked in isolation were integrated into a single monitoring structure. Financial intelligence was strengthened to track unusual cash movements. Digital security teams were trained to recognize patterns of encrypted coordination, not just individual messages. The state stopped reacting to threats and started modeling them, learning how a modern coup actually behaves long before one fully materialized. That is why Prosper was never as invisible as he believed. The moment encrypted communication began flowing from foreign numbers into sensitive military circles, it created a pattern, and patterns are easier to track than people. The moment cash began moving through couriers instead of formal channels, it created a financial signature, and financial signatures are harder to erase than messages. By the time Prosper received the 2 numbers for the package, the security services were no longer asking whether something was happening. They were mapping how it was happening. They were not waiting for a gunshot to confirm a coup. They were reading the anatomy of the operation as it grew. When the mission was finally assigned and the commander became the target, the state already understood what that meant. The drone base was not left exposed. Protective measures were quietly reinforced. Command redundancies were prepared so that removing one man would not collapse the system. What the plotters believed was a single point of failure had already been turned into a network of backups because Traoré's team had anticipated exactly this kind of precision attack. In other words, the trap had been turned inside out. The operation that was meant to blind Burkina Faso had instead illuminated the entire coup network. This is why the arrests did not look chaotic or rushed. They were surgical. Prosper was detained not because he had fired a weapon, but because the state already knew his role, his contacts, and his financial trail. The network was dismantled calmly because it had already been drawn like a map, with Damiba in Togo, King David in Ghana, and each intermediary positioned inside Burkina Faso. What the plotters thought was a decentralized system became, in the hands of Traoré's intelligence services, a fully connected diagram that could be taken apart piece by piece. The most important shift here is psychological. The coup failed not because the state got lucky, but because the state stopped being naive. Traoré understood that modern coups are not announced with tanks. They are assembled with phones and money, and they must be defeated at that level before they ever reach the streets. By the time the plotters believed they were ready to strike, they were already operating inside a system that had absorbed their moves and neutralized their leverage. And that is the moment the story turns outward. Because once the operation was exposed from the inside, a new battle began in the open. If the coup had been mapped and dismantled so cleanly, why did Western media immediately rush to cast doubt on the confession and question whether the plot was even real? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. The reason the story immediately became contested is that Prosper's confession does something Western narratives cannot afford to let happen. It explains African instability in a way that removes Western innocence. Once you accept what he said, the comfortable story that coups are the result of internal chaos or African incompetence collapses. What replaces it is far more uncomfortable. A picture of regime change as a transnational project built with foreign safe havens, encrypted platforms, cash logistics, and proxy officers who never appear on official organizational charts. That is why the first reaction was not to investigate the details, but to blur them. Experts doubt the plot. Analysts question the confession. Evidence is unclear. These phrases did not appear because the facts were weak. They appeared because the facts were too strong and too precise. Look at what the confession actually does. It names the communication structure, the countries involved, the apps used, the financial method, and the operational target. That is not how invented stories behave. Fabrications stay vague because vagueness is safer. This confession is dangerous because it is concrete. It shows exactly how a modern coup is assembled, step by step without ever needing a foreign soldier to cross the border. If that is allowed to stand as truth, then every future attempt to destabilize an African government will be seen not as a local failure, but as a foreign operation. And that changes how Africans understand power, responsibility, and resistance. This is why the narrative had to be softened. By casting doubt, Western media did not disprove the story, they neutralized it politically. Doubt makes the confession harmless. Doubt turns a structural attack into a disputed allegation. Doubt allows the same techniques to be reused in the future because the public never fully internalizes what actually happened. It is a defensive maneuver, not an investigative one. The aim is not truth, but control of interpretation, because interpretation determines whether Africans see themselves as victims of external engineering or as authors of their own instability. What makes this moment so significant is that Burkina Faso did not respond by begging for validation. It acted as if the confession was real, because from the inside, it had already seen the network operate. Arrests, mapping, and dismantling happened quietly and methodically, not theatrically. The state behaved like a system that recognized a threat it had already studied. That contrast between Western doubt and Burkinabe certainty exposes the deeper struggle over who gets to define reality. One side wants the story blurred, the other wants it understood. And that is why Prosper's speech matters far beyond Burkina Faso. It is not just about one failed coup. It is about whether Africa is allowed to name the forces that shape its fate, or whether those forces remain hidden behind language that sounds neutral, but protects power. If this confession is allowed to be dismissed, the playbook survives untouched. If it is understood, the playbook is exposed, and exposure is the beginning of defense. So the question that now hangs over the continent is not whether this coup failed, but whether Africa will recognize this pattern in time when the next encrypted call arrives and decide to break it before it ever becomes another mysterious instability. What this confession ultimately changes is not just the story of one failed coup, but the strategic imagination of an entire continent. For decades, African governments were taught to look for danger in the wrong place, in angry crowds, mutinous soldiers, or noisy opposition figures. Prosper's testimony shows that the real battlefield has shifted. The first shot is no longer fired from a rifle. It is sent from a foreign phone number. The first unit is not a battalion. It is a group chat. The first casualty is not a politician. It is a system that makes sovereignty possible. Once that is understood, the old defensive instincts become obsolete, and a new kind of statecraft becomes necessary. Burkina Faso's survival is therefore not a lucky escape. It is a case study. It shows that sovereignty in 2026 is not defended with slogans or even with weapons alone, but with an intelligence architecture that can see money, messages, and movements as one connected picture. Traoré's greatest achievement was not stopping a single plot. It was learning how plots actually behave and redesigning the state to absorb them. By the time the coup network believed it was ready, it was already operating inside a system that had anticipated its logic and removed its leverage. That is why the collapse felt quiet and clinical instead of dramatic. The story did not end with explosions because it ended with understanding. This is why Prosper's confession will outlive the individuals involved. It gives African states a manual, not for rebellion, but for defense. It teaches them what to watch, where to look, and how to think. It shows that the real contest is not between leaders and their rivals, but between systems that produce dependency and systems that produce independence. Once that lesson is internalized, the balance of power begins to shift, because the same techniques that once operated invisibly lose their advantage the moment they are recognized. The danger now is not that another coup will come. It is that this lesson will be ignored. If the confession is treated as a curiosity instead of a warning, the same playbook will be reused, just with new names and new phone numbers. But if it is taken seriously, Africa does not merely defend itself. It changes the rules of the game. The next encrypted call becomes a signal to strengthen systems, not a trigger for panic. The next cash courier becomes evidence, not leverage. The next pastor becomes a protected node, not a hidden vulnerability. And that is the final shift this story offers. From reaction to anticipation, from fragility to resilience, from being shaped by hidden forces to shaping one's own future. Burkina Faso did not just survive a coup. It showed what survival looks like in the age of encrypted power. The question that remains is not whether the empire will try again, because it will, but whether the rest of Africa will learn this lesson in time to make the next attempt fail before it ever becomes more than a vibration on a phone. Let us know in the comment section. Was the state quick enough? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.